Hi, Diana. Welcome to this episode. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for having me. This is a great opportunity to be in your podcast.
So let's start off by introducing yourself. Anything you want to share with us?
My name is Diana Grimaldos, and I am a community engaged scholar. I am also an equity practitioner and a system leader. So I currently work as a manager of community investment with United Way Greater Toronto, where my part of my role is to oversee the intimate partner and gender-based violence portfolio. Additionally, I also convene one of the city clusters, which is the Your Western Pelham cluster. What this is a cross-sector space that brings people together and organizations together, oftentimes grassroots leaders, city staff, service providers, academics, with the goal to foster collaborative problem solving and advance system change. So when you invited me to these podcasts, the first thing you asked me was my leadership style, and so I've been thinking about that. For me, my leadership really is deeply relational, and I think you and I have that conversation about that because my leadership is also grounded in curiosity and is rooted in the continuous process of learning and unlearning. Part of my work in all of the areas that I influence is to center equity and racial justice, not just as a value, but it's also as a practice. It's a way of being and knowing and leading. I have explored my own scholarship, inclusive leadership as a lifelong journey shaped by my personal histories, my cultural legacies, and collective responsibilities. How my leadership is being shaped is by my history of migration as a Latin American woman who is also a mother, and community has been my greatest teachers. So for me, that's like how I've been shaping all my work in all of the spaces that I'm in. So for me, navigating new system as a racialized newcomer, raising my children while also building my career and holding a space in equity deserving communities has really shaped my leadership from the inside and out.
I
Yeah.
really see a through line there, right? Like where you come from, your life experiences, and how it links to leadership, especially in that relational sense and the learning and the unlearning you mentioned.
Yeah, like I often reflect in how our own lived experience inform all our practices, and especially when we hold leadership positions, right? Because a leadership practice is both political but also transformative. So for me, leadership is not just about the individual heroism that we thought at school. It is about more of collective care and disrupting structures that exclude people. In my research practice, I have built on the work of Dr. Vidya Shah, who was my professor and who also emphasized in leadership as a relational and a justice-oriented act. So her framing really focuses on leadership as a disruption. And so that really resonated with me deeply as part of my practice. So, and it's a value that I hold in the spaces where my identity as a racialized, multilingual immigrant woman, my identities are not just an afterthought. It's how I lead. And they're part of my framework. They shape how I navigate power, how I build trust, how I create space for others. And one of the most important principles for me is leading from the margins, because the margins are often the vantage point that exposes both harm and the possibilities, right? And so for me, my work really explores how leaders with intersectional identities, especially women and women of color, bring their critical insights into organizational transformation. And so I work with community leaders, EDs, as I hold the gender-based violence and women's portfolio. And it is for me crucial and a principal value that their leadership is despite of their positionality, not because of it. So that is something that for me, I'm always learning from these leaders. I'm always fascinated by the power that they bring into spaces. So it's a collective learning and a collective process.
What you said about leadership as a disruption really resonated with me because leaders want to transform. right? Or have to transform, because there are ways you can lead in a non-disruptive way. But what I think is most challenging, and I've heard somewhere this saying, I don't remember who said it, that leading when there's no crisis is relatively easy, but leading through crisis disruption is where a leader is truly tested.
Definitely.
Yeah. So talking about leadership and disrupting, let's look at like teams you worked with. And I know this can be internal teams, but in your case, it can also be external teams where you partner with different other organizations with the same mission or a common goal. What are the signs for you that a team is really working well together and performing as they want to bring about these transformations? What are some things you look for as signposts?
This is a very important question as we get to work with different identities, different personalities, different positionalities. So for me, building a high performant team is one that is based in trust as the baseline. Not just the goal, is where equity is operationalized, not just theorized. It is a space where different is not just tolerated but leveraged, and where everyone feels safe enough to be brave. And you know that your leadership is working when people feel seen, stretched, and supported all at once. So oftentimes when we think about brave spaces, we think that creating safety for people is one size fits all. But it's not often the case, because do people feel safe enough to challenge? Do people speak up and fail forward? I think to create these conditions, we need to make considerations about positionalities, about identities, about what's brave enough in a space for people to feel that they can challenge. And that comes with the leadership. We can also talk about share power. How are decision making and leadership truly distributed? And we also think about alignment with values. And we can ask, our practices reflective of our equity commitments? So for me, building trust is through consistency, right? We create transparency process, but we also create repair, because we don't often talk about reparation. I regularly create feedback loops and admit when I have made mistakes, and engage in practices of accountability, ensuring that as a leader, I also make mistakes. And mostly I make mistakes and I learn from there. Leadership is not about perfection, it's about integrity and relational repair. So I fundamentally believe that leadership is relational, not transactional. And so there are three practical leadership actions that I use or that I consider important. One of them is name power, and making power visible and discuss it openly. So when I talk about or think about naming power, it's part of a foundational equity practice. And from an equity point of view, naming power means making visible the often unspoken dynamics and who holds influence, decision making authority, access, resources, and who doesn't. So what that looks like, for instance, in our work as leaders, is making invisible visible. And so I will often ask question, who has the power to decide? Who is most impacted by it? Are they at the table? Whose voices are missing and whose voices are centered? Are those who are marginalized missing from the conversation? Because power often operates silently in institutions, and it shows up in who sets the agenda, for instance, who gets to listen, who is included or who is excluded. So naming power is a really disruption and get us to ask these questions, right? And so that's part of like the leadership disruption that I was talking early. Um, and acknowledging positionality, power, and privilege. So for me, from an equity deserving lens, leaders must acknowledge their privilege that they carry in. So I have to understand that when I go into spaces, I am a funder, whether my power is by my race or my class, my education, gender, my ability, my job title, what I represent for the different spaces where I show up. And I think holding a space for counterpower is also an important element of naming power because it also creates a space for redistribution and accountability. When we name how systems of oppression, like for instance, colonialism, racism, patriarchy, are embedded in our organizational norms, they can actually work to share decision-making authority, for instance, create feedback mechanisms for those most impacted, but also ensure accountability to community, not just hierarchy. So one of the examples that I can bring in my practice, and I'll mention a few just to kind of give you context. So instead of making a decision in a leadership team, in a close leadership team, so for instance, we need feedback on a granting process. As a funder, we hold power in this space. That means we must slow down and co-create decision with those who has been impacted by their work. So asking organizations feedback, service users, and how they perceive the applications to be, getting their feedback to ensure that those are co-creating spaces by equity leading practices. For instance, in a meeting, I mentioned that I facilitate clock cluster coordination work. I often, if I notice that certain voices haven't been heard or certain organizations haven't spoke, I pause and I check to see if those perspectives can be included, ask if they want to be included, and question if those perspectives are missing and why are they missing, right? So creating that space and holding a space for that. And when I think about strategy development, when I support organizations within my firm, part of the work is mapping out power dynamics in the systems before they decide who leads and who has decision power and who has power of influence. And so for me, this is important because when leaders fail to name power, the consequences are that the harms get reproduced under a guise of collaboration and neutrality, and marginalized voices continue to be sidelined, even when we create well-meaning spaces. And so, but when we actively name and address power, it does the opposite. It builds trust, it redistributes influence, and it signals that equity is not just a value, but it is a practice.
I really like what you said. The equity is not a value, it's a practice, right? Because we can hold the value, but really putting it into practice is what's needed for everyone in organizations as well as society overall. Diana, there was so much gold there. I took a lot of notes and I have a lot of follow-up questions. So I'm going to go into it little by little. First, when you spoke about the brave spaces, you mentioned to be seen, stretched, and supported all at once. I thought that was a really good framework. So I work with a lot of coaching clients from different backgrounds, especially cultural backgrounds. And being seen, stretched, and supported looks different for different people based on culture or even any other identity or life experience we bring in to our workplaces. How do you kind of accommodate for those variances?
That's a very important question and a difficult one too, because when we think about what is holding up organizations and cultures to create spaces where people feel that they belong, where people feel that they have agency, and where people feel brave enough to speak up, I think it has to do with how do we understand the challenges that organization face, and how do we tackle those challenges? So for me, as a consultant, has worked with organization and as staff to name what are the challenges that they're facing and what organizations are doing to support them in the process. And exactly what you say, Sabrina, the different identities, the different positionalities that we bring into our space. As I mentioned in my introduction, like I'm a mom.
Mm.
right? So I come in with a very different lived experience that someone that perhaps don't experience the world with motherhood in mind, right? So accommodations for the workplace might be different from someone who is a parent, who someone who is not. The requirements that a woman might need might be different from an LGBTQ plus individual. So I think when I think about these challenges, I think about burnout from the multiple ongoing crises that are going on leadership, right? And so one of the most persistent challenges that I observe, especially in the non-for-profit and in the public sector and working with the public sector, is a culture of perfectionism. This is an important conversation that I don't think we're having enough. And is deeply ingrained in the norm rooted in white supremacy culture. One scholar that described this culture is Tema Okun, in where she described perfectionism as creating the condition where mistakes are feared. And there's always this urgency is prioritized over reflection. So outcomes matter more than relationships or processes. And so I work really, really hard to build relationships and to value those more than outputs and outcomes. So from an equity point of view, perfectionism only reinforces exclusion and uphold dominant standards of professionalism. So the expectations of what professionalism mean can vary from culture to culture. And it is often silence creativity. It also silence lived experience. And it's also not culturally grounded as ways of working, right? So for equity deserving leaders, unlearning perfectionism is a political and a relational act. So I intentionally uh, work in building those relationships. It means making room for iteration, for discomfort, for learning and unlearning in public, which means for me is honoring process of relational accountability as core measure of success. So as a leader, I try to model imperfection openly and name when urgency or polish is getting on the way of depth and inclusion. So I also often stop and ask the question, is this needs to happen right now? Let's pause, reflect. Why is this urgent? And what is the urgency? Right? Because for me, urgency is cultural a major issue because we're in this relentless pace that leaves no room for care, for relationship, to pause, to ask about each other's children, to ask about our dogs, to have those, conversations that really get us to know the other person in a very different level, in a more meaningful way, right? Those little coffee side conversations at lunchrooms or in the hallway sometimes can mean more than the 30-minute book meeting that we have to talk about a very specific project that needs deadlines. So in my work, Sarina, I argue that a symptom of dominant leadership paradigms are rooted in the extraction and control. But inclusive leadership requires a countercultural pace, slower, relational, and intentional, not performative. So does that kind of answer some of your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. You go back to the relational element, right? Which is key for leaders because leaders are leading other people, and if they don't have relationships and genuine relationships, right? Like you said, not performative, but real relationships, getting to know your people as people, I think is fundamental to being a good leader in disruption or not, right? The other thing that we wanted to ask about was repairing. We talk a lot about repair in different contexts. We talk about it a lot in like personal, intimate relationships, and then you talk about it from a psychological perspective. But the angle you're bringing it in is at the workplace, also from a diversity and marginalized community perspective, also in that leader and team dynamic and how it can really help. Because another thing you said was leaders are not perfect, or nor do we need to be, right? That's not the expectation. But going a little bit into that repair and how you really practically implement that, I think we touched on it a little bit, like naming the power, asking the right questions, holding space, all of that. But I wonder if there's anything else you want to talk about the repair and how you facilitate that.
Yeah. When we think about the intersections of what we bring into the space as employees, but also as our full selves, who we are in the world. And so, one of the things that I often see being left out is our emotions at work, because it feels like it's separated. But to me, I see emotion as vital data, right? I think that this is part of the reparation process, because suppressing our emotions at work is often framed as professionalism. You know, we have to be professional. We can show any kind of feelings because we are at work, and we have to have different expectations of how do we act at work and how do we act outside of work. And to me, that is actually a barrier to connection and learning, right? Because emotional intelligence is so central to equity-based leadership. It helps us move from transactional to transformational practice, and it also helps us build trust. Build trust is fundamentally part of the transparency and reparation process, right? So we need to create mechanisms for people to feel that they can trust their colleagues, that they can have difficult conversations. I feel that we are not having enough difficult conversations. I feel that we're so afraid to send that email. I feel that we're so afraid to ask that question because of what my boss is going to think. Or if I ask that question to my staff, are they going to feel that they're being challenged? So, because we're not having difficult conversations, we're not having enough. And when we do, we are reactive rather than relational. So, sometimes questions are asked because curiosity, because they help build, repair, and have a learning process, a collective process. So for me as a leader, I deeply value opportunities to unlearn and to reflect. It's not to challenge, but to have those difficult conversations, because those conversations would allow us to sit in discomfort and grow from it, build capacity within our things, build individual capacity. Like, to me, I'm in a long life journey. I'm always learning. And I think we need structures that normalize conflict as part of the co-creation, not as something that we need to avoid, but something that we can approach with care. And that's part of the reparation process to me, right? It's about integrity, but also relational repair. If I'm having a difficult conversation of something that I wasn't aware, I'm oftentimes very appreciative of being brought into light to something that I wasn't aware, and that now I'm going to influence this in my practice. So I can bring an example in one of our team conversations at work. I mentioned the word neurodivergency and neuroinclusion, and how it was important to make considerations when we do presentations about having our slide decks being inclusive. And someone didn't know what that was. And because they were brave enough to ask, we have the opportunity then I prepare a neuro inclusion workshop to talk about what that's like and what it means and what is meant to be neurodivergent. And so have that opportunity to learn from each other. And so it was a good learning practice for our team, because people felt appreciative that they learned something that perhaps they're not using in the everyday practice, but is right there. And we were able to bring it into the space as part of our learning and grow process, and as part of that reparation of like not knowing that we haven't been using this practice because there was no awareness of it, right? And that was not that judgment of like saying, why are we not doing this and why haven't we incorporated these conversations before, but like how we're going to incorporate them moving forward.
Yeah, there was a lot of trust in that team container, right? For that person to be brave enough to ask. And because of that question, the question facilitated so much growth and like you said, unlearning in public, right? So you spoke about the potentially one of the biggest challenges in the nonprofit and public sector as being perfectionism. Do you think that's the biggest challenge in the nonprofit slash public sector world right now?
I think it's a combination of living in this urgency of the corporate world must shift, right? We like
Yeah.
urgently, everything is shifting, everything is fast paced, from structured leadership models to being really relational and equity centered ones. So I feel that we live in a space where we cannot hold a space for imperfection. We cannot take time to reflect. The world is going through a very difficult place. Like we are dealing with major challenges. And I see it in my work. Organizations or staff who are working with underserved communities are burning out because there's so many crises ongoing, right? People are tired and leaders get tired.
Yeah.
And we don't make a space for caring. We don't make a space for repairing. We're in this space of like performative equity, right? Where inclusion is not seen without redistribution of power. We create spaces to have performative equity spaces where no action is being taken. And there's a lack of reflective spaces. So everything moves too fast for deep learning. We move into the next challenge without having the time to pause and reflect of what was the learning, what have we learned from that experience, what are the things that we can do better. The other piece, Serena, for me, not having that intentionality at core is what create cultures that are excluding, that otherize, right? We're not being intentional about how we can slow down and listen, and deeply intentionally and without the need to respond right away to an issue that is perhaps having significant consequences in how we approach the world. So the way I see that culture of white supremacy and urgency is intentional too, right? And so for me, listening is an act of resistance in a world that demand urgency and perfection all the time. So I intentionally take the time to listen and to think about how may I influencing the world in a positive way, even in the little spaces that I'm in. I don't think the world needs more charismatic leaders. I think we need courageous, accountable ones who can make a space for others to lead and to pause and reflect.
Yeah. That was so beautifully said, Diana. So perfectionism and urgency, how it even hinders learning, right? Building a learning culture is what I'm pulling out from what you're saying. So given that this is one of the biggest challenges we're dealing with at this time, I think we've already spoken about a few solutions, but if you were to give the listeners one thing or two things that are small enough that they can do tomorrow or this week, what would that be? What's that action?
Well, I said it before, and I'm going to re-emphasize it.
Mhm.
I think we need to slow down and listen. I invite leaders to have a coffee chat with a colleague, ask and listen, right? Do it intentionally. Think of a question that can support that relational and equity center model that I spoke about, and think about how could you support your team, or what can you learn from this person? Because I often think that we don't see as much as other people's gift as we see power. So there's a lot on learning when we remove power away from relationships. And so if you can have a coffee shop with a staff, or connect with someone that perhaps you admire, or someone that you haven't talked yet, reach out to them through LinkedIn like you did, Sabrina, which I really appreciate, and have that conversation, because I do think that that also gives us the courage to get to know someone that comes with a lot of gifts. And it gives us the opportunity to build that foundational leadership that allow us to get to know each other and build collaborative spaces rather than competitive and performative ones.
So simply listen, right? Like be intentional about listening and building those relations. So you said before listening is an act of resistance. That really
Yes.
resonated with me because listening is not performative, right? It's not loud, but there is so much resistance in deeply listening to someone and creating that space. And it's also a gift that we can give anyone, right? It doesn't even have to be a long conversation, even a really short conversation. There is that gift of listening we can all give.
Absolutely.
In closing today's episode, if anyone wants to connect with you to go a little deeper into any of these things, what's the best way to get in touch with you? And also, are there other ways we can support you in any of the consulting work? Feel free to share anything.
Well, I fundamentally have my practice to support organizations or to support individuals who are embarking in conversations, deep rooted conversations of equity. So you can feel free to reach out to me through my LinkedIn page. You can find my name, Diana Grimaldos, and it's open. Send me a message and tell me how can I support, how my firm, Inclusive Leaders, can also support your work. We have a team that is available to support organizations that are asking these questions, that are looking to have deep reflections about their processes and how they can influence their workplace. And even if it's as a personal level, if you has any questions, feel free to reach out. And I'm a lifelong learner. So if there's an opportunity for me to learn, it's always welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to add those links to the podcast notes as well. So anyone can go find you easily on LinkedIn or on the Inclusive Leaders website as well. So Diana, thank you so much. This was such a deep and insightful conversation. Like I said, I took a lot of notes. There was so much, like you went really deeply into what these pieces mean and also brought examples and really clarified things for me as well as anyone who will be listening as well. So thank you so much for your time and all your valuable insights. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Sabrina, for the opportunity.